Hi and welcome to this tutorial on using the Star Xterminator plugin for processing your images in Affinity Photo, Photoshop or PixInsight. For the purposes of today's tutorial I'll be using Affinity Photo. So I downloaded the Star Xterminator plugin and installed it in Affinity, and it's available now under the filters menu. If you're using Photoshop instead of Affinity Photo, the procedure should be virtually identical, but for ease of use I'll just use Affinity Photo for today. Now on the screen at the moment is a hydrogen alpha image that I took of the lovely Nebula NGC 3324, which is visible at the top left of the image. But because the field of view of the telescope is so wide, it's also picked up quite a bit of the Eta Carina Nebula itself. These were taken using the Chile 2 telescope, which is one of my favourite telescopes of all, with its nice, fast, wide optics. When I set up the data set, I grabbed a deep set of hydrogen alpha images, which you can see on the screen, but I also shot sulfur 2 and oxygen 3 images at the same time, and the idea of course is to produce an SHO image using the Hubble palette, and we'll see how that works in a minute. Now what I tend to do when I'm working with images like this is quite often, not always, but quite often, I may use the hydrogen alpha component as a luminance frame, because it does tend to boost the signal of the image and it generally produces more pleasing images overall. But that might not be to everybody's taste to do that, so I'll show how that's done just initially at the beginning of the tutorial, but you may prefer just to work on the SHO data itself and not use the hydrogen alpha frame as a luminance frame. I can show you the SHO image. Both this, as you can see it's on the screen at the moment, both this image and the hydrogen alpha image have been very minimally processed. I'd stacked these frames together but have hardly applied any more processing to the images. I just saved them as 16-bit TIFF files, and that's the images we're looking at on the screen at the moment. Now looking at this image here, we can see the background's a little bit light, so initially, just as a first step, I'm going to apply a levels transformation to the image just to darken the sky background. Now what will happen is, in Affinity, when you apply things like the levels adjustment to an image, it creates something called an adjustment layer, and I've sort of talked about these briefly in the past in the previous tutorials, and these work fine. They're non-destructive layers, and they work really well, but I'm kind of old school. I tend to just work with a single layer at a time basically. So for example, when I do this following adjustment, which is the levels transformation, I'm going to use Control L. It's a shortcut on the keyboard, and it brings up the levels menu. Now you can see we've got a big gap here, predictably enough, where the sky background is really light. We've got this big gap on the left side of the black pixels in the image, black on the left, white on the right. So the way I normally work with this is just to pull the black level slider over to darken the sky background. Now a lot of people might be tempted to just bring this over all the way to where the black pixels start to sort of rise up in the histogram, but I like to leave a little bit of headroom so we can come back and make adjustments further along. So I'm going to leave it at something like that for now, and once I'm happy with that setting, I'll normally just click on the merge button, and that just flattens the image down to a single layer. Now it's important to mention at this point in the tutorial, you will need to have both the layers menu open on the screen, as you can see here, but also the history menu, because we will use this a bit later on. If you're not familiar with the history menu, it allows you to step back and look at previous adjustments that you've made to the image, and this is quite handy. If you apply a processing step that you don't like, you can just click back a few stages and it reverts the image back to an earlier state. And both Photoshop and Affinity have this, and it's a really useful tool. So I'm happy with that. That's absolutely fine. If you haven't got the layers menu or the history menu on the screen, you're not sure how to do it, you just come up to the view button on the top, scroll down to where it says Studio, and then move across, and you can see we've got layers on here, which is already ticked. We've got history already ticked, and a few others that are just off screen at the moment. So if you haven't got those menus on the screen, access them in this way, click them and they'll pop up on the screen. And of course they can be moved around if they're blocking any part of the screen. So for my processing stream, the next step I'd apply is to have the SHO image on the screen. I'll use Control C as a shortcut just to copy it into the clipboard, and I can click on that to close it down now. We come back to our hydrogen alpha image, and I'm going to paste in the SH2 data on top of it as a floating layer, and this is exactly the same technique as if you were creating an LRGB image. The first thing we have to do, of course, for this to work is convert this to a 16-bit colour file, an RGB image, because if we left it on the grayscale as it is at the moment, when I pasted the colour information on top, it would just be monochrome. And so the way we convert this is come up to Document, Convert Format, and click on here, and we can see RGB 16. Click on Convert. You won't see any change to the image, but it's now a colour file. So bear in mind we've got the SHO image in the clipboard at the moment. I'm just going to go Control V to paste it on top, and it's done. That's created a new layer, so we have a 2-layer image now. This top one is the colour image, and if I hide that, you can see the H alpha image underneath. And these have been pre-aligned, by the way. If you hadn't aligned the images, you can do that at this stage just by clicking on the top layer, taking the opacity down to around about 50%, and then you can move the top layer relative to the base layer to get a good alignment. But when I stack these images together, I did all the alignment back at that stage. Now there's one final thing we need to do to meld these two images together, and that's just to come up to where it says normal here. This is the layer blending mode, and then scroll right the way down, and I come across to the option colour. And now we have what's technically it's not technically an LRGB image, but it's the same principle as an LRGB image. We've got the SHO data on the top. And if you find it easy to work like this, you can click on that and just call it SHO, and you might do the same thing here and just call it HA for a hydrogen alpha, just as a reminder of what's going on if you're sort of new to the procedure. But basically that's what we've done. We've created a nice combination of the two images. We've got all of the incredible detail within the hydrogen alpha file and all the lovely colours so far in the basic SHO image. At this stage we can apply a little bit of colour processing to the image if we like. If we're happy with the so-called luminance component, the hydrogen alpha frame, and you don't need to make any more adjustments to that, you can do a few minor colour adjustments. We'll leave the majority of these until later on. As you'll see, it's a much more powerful method to work once we've used the Star Xterminator plugin. If we wish to change some of the colours a little bit on this SHO image, I'm going to go to my adjustment layers menu, which is just off the screen at the moment. This is what it looks like, and you've got all these options here. You can see selective colour there, but I like to work with two monitors, so I tend to have a lot of these menus off screen. So if you can just imagine that, for example, I'm going to click on selective colour, but I'll just move this off screen again and then click on selective colour, and that brings up this menu here. Now you may be familiar with this. If you've done SHO processing before using the Hubble palette, this is the most powerful tool you can use to get those really nice colours in your data. Basically, if you've not used it before, you've got a list of all these different colours down here. I normally just use red to magentas, but you can experiment with the blacks and whites. You might find that works for you. It defaults to red, and then below that you've got these three. Well, again, I tend to ignore the black slider most of the time, but do experiment with that. I tend to just work with these three, and basically this is quite nothing too sort of scientific here in terms of processing, but you'll see a real-time effect when you start moving these sliders around. So with the red selected, if I move this slider backwards and forwards, you may notice that the red component of the image, which is quite subtle at this stage, is just beginning to peep through. Again, just experiment with these sliders. Not expecting too much to happen at this stage. We'll see more action in just a minute. If we're happy with that, I'll come down to the yellows, and now by dragging this cyan slider over to the left, you can see we're changing those yellow colours to more sort of reddish now, and this is looking quite good. We're sort of going in the right direction now. The things we need to look for are the colours within this kind of very structured, looks to me like the edge of the nebula, and then we've also got this very bright bluish component down here. So obviously this part of the nebula, the Eta Carina Nebula here, and up here in NGC 3324, there's a very strong blue and cyan component there. Obviously it's very strong in oxygen 3. So once we start to adjust this, we need to just keep an eye on these to make sure that we're not, for example, if we're looking at this component down here, when we use these sliders, we'll actually change this as well. So we need to keep an eye on both of these, although they're subtly quite different in terms of their colour. This is much more blue, that's much more of a cyan. So you can see how the effects that these slides are having. It's looking quite good. We're definitely going in the right direction. Greens, so there's probably not too much greens in this image. I think it's a little bit just up here in this area, but just moving this backwards and forwards. You can see a subtle change up there. We don't really need to do too much with this slider at this point. So I'll pretty much leave that one where it is. And then the cyans, you'll expect to see quite a bit of a change here as we experiment with these sliders. Again, it's far better to do this in fairly small increments. We don't need to do too much here at this point. In fact, I'm probably going to leave this image as it is now. It's looking quite good. We're only doing a basic processing step at this part of the procedure. So once again, I've clicked on merge and we've just blended it down into a single layer. One thing to bear in mind as well that might trip you up, that step I just showed where we used the selective colour menu, make sure you have the SHO colour layer selected when you apply that. If you apply it to the hydrogen alpha filter, you won't see many changes. So you can always tell a layer is selected by the fact that it's got this bright blue band on it. So that just makes life a little bit easier. But do remember that step when you're processing the colour data. So this is looking quite good. I'm quite happy with that so far. You might find it easier to just save this image at this stage. And if you click on File and then Save As, the file extension that comes up is AF Photo for Affinity's own format, and that will save your image as a layered file. But bear in mind, I think that file format is only recognised by Affinity, so if you had your layered file and you decided to try using some of Photoshop's processing on it, Photoshop won't recognise that AF Photo format. So if you want to work within both programs, the best option is to export the file. It's just up here, File, Export, and from this list of options here, choose PSD, which is Photoshop's own layered file format, and then you just export the image and it's saved with a PSD extension, which Photoshop does recognise. Okay, that's a brief introduction to the use of combining SHO data with hydrogen alpha as a kind of so-called luminance frame. And again, that might not be to everybody's taste. I find that on some images it works really well and gives a really strong, vibrant image. But if you're not happy with that, just work on the SHO image itself. We don't really need this layer structure anymore, so at this point we can flatten the image. So document, flatten, and now we've lost our dual layer option. We've just got this image as combined file. Just for brevity, I'll click on File, Save As, and we can call this one 3324 HASHO. And we've got this in case we need to come back to it as a later date. Now this is where we're going to start to use the Star Xterminator tool, because it is really brilliant. But the first thing we're going to do is create a duplicate layer, and we do that coming up to the layer menu and then scroll down to duplicate. What we've got here on the right, you can see our layers menu's changed. We have our image occupying both layers at the same time. There's no change between these two. And what we're going to do, let's rename this one at the top. I'm going to use the term I've mentioned before. I'm going to call it reality check, because by having that as an incorporated layer in the layer stack, we can always come back to that image at any point to check that we're getting the results that we want and we're not going off in the wrong direction. It becomes quite useful later on when we're doing a sort of before and after comparison. So now we'll call up the Star Xterminator tool. Now the first thing you have to do, if you're working in this way, is select the base layer. Again, both of these are the same, but we're going to work on the base layer. And then you come up to Filters, Plugins, and then come across to RC Astro and then Star Xterminator. Now you'll see this little menu pop up on the screen. It's prompting us at this point to download the AI model. This plugin relies on something called a neural network, or artificial intelligence if you like, to extract the stars from the image. And every time we apply this tool we have to download the AI model, because I believe it is updated on quite a regular basis. So it's not too much of a problem. Click on download AI and it will start downloading the model. It depends on your internet speed. I find it normally takes about a minute or so. You can see the countdown as you like as it's coming down. It normally gets to about 80% and then it's ready to be applied. I'll leave it running for now, just to give you an idea of the time you should expect to see it working. And the idea is that once the AI model is downloaded, we come up to the OK button at the top of the screen and click OK and off it goes. Now while it's downloading, in fact it's done that already, I'll click on OK, and whilst you're working in Affinity you won't see anything happening now, except that perhaps you can see at the moment we've got these borders have lit up and it says Affinity Photo not responding, but don't worry if you see that. This is just because Affinity hasn't got a fuel gauge associated with the plugin that's running in the background. You can see the cursor going round on the screen. It doesn't mean that the program's crashed, it just means it's doing all the number crunching in the background. So what I tend to do at this stage is just don't touch anything, just sit back and let the model be applied. And it generally takes about 2 minutes for this Star Xterminator tool to be applied, so you just have to sit back and be patient. What can happen as well is it'll look like you've been sort of thrown out of the Affinity Photo program, but don't worry, again it's just been kind of minimized. I'll show you how we get round that in a minute once it's finished doing the modeling on the image. If you're doing this same technique in Photoshop, it's not a problem because you will get a fuel gauge come up on the screen and the program won't appear to have crashed. You can see the progress of the tool as it's running, and then the image, as you'll see, it'll be available on the screen. So I'll let this run for the purposes of the tutorial, and providing it doesn't take too long, I'll leave this in real time so that it gives you a good feel for how long it takes to apply this effect. But I assure you the wait is worth its weight in gold, so to speak. So it's still ticking away, shouldn't be too much longer now. And the idea is that because we've selected the two layers, I actually just selected the base layer for this to be applied to, what will happen is once the tool's finished working, we should have the starless, or the image with the stars removed on the base layer, and our reality check image, which we set up earlier on, that still has the stars embedded in it. So we can use the layers menu just to switch backwards and forwards to see the difference that the Star Xterminator plugin has made. It's pretty good in that it can deal with most types of stars. I mean, to be fair, narrowband images are easier for the tool to work on because the stars tend to be much finer and probably less bright and this kind of thing compared to, say, a deep broadband image, but it works equally well with both. So if you've not seen this tool in operation before, you might find it quite interesting to see the effect it has on the image once it's applied. So it's still ticking away there in the background. I'm hoping that it'll be ready to astound us in any second now. Okay, you can see the borders in the program have changed now, and the cursor's changed back to this hand sign that we had previously, and it looks like we haven't been kicked out of the program. But sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. I didn't touch anything today and it's just left me in the program, so that's fine. As I said, if it does, click on the icon just down here and it will bring you back into it. Now let's have a look at what the plugin has done. If I come up to our reality check layer, that's what we're seeing at the moment, but I can hide that by just unticking it. And now you've got the view of the nebula in great detail now without the stars, and it gives you a very, very different view. I always find these views, once the tool's been applied, very, very interesting, because once the stars have been removed, it's a bit less of a distraction. You can see sort of rather amusingly we've got a few diffraction spikes left over, but they're okay. They can be dealt with if you wish later on. You can see they're associated with these two sort of bright stars here, but they're not going to be a problem at all. So what we can do, if it helps you when you're processing, we can just call this no stars, and we've got a reality check thing here, so you can switch between the two. Very interesting to do that. But what we'll do now is we'll create a kind of mixture of these two to isolate just the stars from the image. And this is where we'll need to come over to our history menu in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do here is, with our two images in the layers menu, come up to the layer blend mode and change it, scroll down to difference. And what we're seeing here now is the difference between the image with the stars in and the stars removed, and basically what that does, it gives us an image of just the stars themselves. The sky background is going to be very dark because this is almost acting like a kind of mask, but we don't need to worry about that. It doesn't affect anything we're doing too much at this stage. So once you've reached this point where you have the stars isolated, what I usually do is I'm going to flatten the image again. So I'll do document flatten, and we've just got the isolated stars here. So the first thing I'll do is file, save as, and I'll just call it stars. Again, we use Affinity's own file format, it's just a bit easier. Okay, and once we've done that, we're kind of finished with this part of the image, but for convenience I'm going to use Control-C again to copy the star image into the clipboard. So Control-C. So once we've done that, we can now come across to the history menu. We can jump back to earlier states of the image to see what we've done, but basically the step we want to go back to is this one here, where we have the reality check image and the no stars image underneath available on the screen again. Now don't forget, when we created the star image just now, not only did I just save it, but I also copied it into the clipboard, because what we're now going to do is paste the star only image into this image. But it's really important that you remember to click on the no stars layer first before you do this, and then I'll use Control-V to bring the image in, and there it is. Again, if we're losing track at all, we can just call this stars, and you can see exactly what we've got. They've got our original image, the reality check. If we hide that, we've got the stars on their own. If we hide that, we've got the starless image. So we've got a nice multiple stack here that we can sort of work with, which is really convenient. But if we want to incorporate these stars into the starless layer, we have to do one final blend, and that's back up to here again, the layer blending mode, but this time we'll come down to the one called screen. And hey, this is great. What we've got now is our stars blended in with the starless layer. Now, one thing you may notice, if we click on this top layer, our reality check layer, you can hardly see any difference now when these are hidden and shown. So that's the reality check layer, and that's our blended layer. Hardly any difference. In fact, I think the only real difference you'll notice is that when you use that screen blend mode, you may notice that the stars in the double layer down here, they might be ever so slightly fainter compared to the reality check layer. Now that actually might suit your purposes. If you're one of these people who like to reduce the effect of the stars in an image to enhance the nebula, you really don't need to do anything else. If you wanted to adjust the star layer at all, it's a simple matter. For example, if you want to brighten the stars, so we can click on our star layer, hide the base image, so we're just working on this star layer. You could call up the levels menu, and for example you could drag the white point slider over to the left. This is probably much further than you'd ever want to do, but I'll just demonstrate it. Click on merge and then reveal the base layer again, and you can see the stars are much more obvious now. If I show you the reality check layer and then without and with so on, you can see we've actually boosted the visibility of the stars, but we don't really need to do that at this point. I think as it had done originally was absolutely fine. So we can undo that adjustment I've just shown you by clicking back using the layers menu here to back to this point here, and we've got our image. Now, this is all looking great. This is a really good place to be now, because it means that when we're working on for example, adjusting the contour brightness, the details within the main image without the stars, all of the changes that we will make from this point onwards should really make no difference to the stars in the image. So if we start to apply some effects to this, we won't be affecting the stars, and this is exactly the purpose of doing this procedure. So what can we do? Well, one of my favourite tools when I get to this point in an image is to apply some stretching to the base layer. The tool I'm going to use for that is found up here in one of these personas. Now, with the image open on the screen in the normal way, it's in the photo persona, and this is how you work on a day-to-day basis. But Affinity has these other personas, and these two here are particularly useful. The one we'll concentrate on now is the tone mapping persona. So if you click on that, remember to first of all select your base layer, the image with no stars, and you can either leave the stars visible as you apply this, or you can hide them. It's entirely up to you. We've got this great flexibility now. Let's keep them hidden and come up to the tone mapping persona, and it will open this sub menu within the program. It takes a little bit of time to apply the effect to the image, but yeah, that's all okay. We'll just sit back and make it. It's only a short period of time, and when the image is pre-processed, you can see here that it's kind of wildly over processed, and this is because this tone mapping persona always applies a full 100% tone compression to the image. So we basically need to start off by just backing that right the way back down. You can take it back down to 0 if you like, or if you want to brighten the image a small amount, you can just give it a tiny little boost. You won't need to have much on here. And then the next effect, which is where the real magic of this tool comes in, is the local contrast slider beneath it. So as I drag this over to the right, watch the effect it has on the nebula in the main image. Something like that's probably quite good. 28% in the case of this image. If I take it back to the original and then just apply that again, around about 28, that's absolutely fine. I hope you can see that we've managed to extract an incredible amount of detail out of the image, and you can zoom in on that just using the scroll wheel on the mouse. Up here to the main nebula, again a bit of diffraction spikes here, but not too much of a problem. But hopefully you can see there's a huge amount of detail that's popped up in this image now. So once you're happy with that, and you can use these other sliders down here if you wish, I tend to just use these two at this stage, and then come back to these if I need to at a later point. So I click on apply, and we just come out of the tone map persona back to the photo persona, and here's our image. Again, without the stars still. I can show you the before and after. It's quite dramatic, as you can see. We can bring the stars back in, and you can see they're no different to how they were before, but now we can see through the stars, if you like, to this amazing structural detail within the nebula itself. So this is great. By the way, we can also click on our reality check layer as well to see the before and after. Again, it's always a good idea to do that, just to make sure you haven't pushed the image too far. And I think from this point onwards, there's not much more we need to do to the image. We can, for example, darken the sky background a little bit further. Again, click on our base layer. I'll use Ctrl L to bring this up. Now we can just pinch this over a little bit, just to darken the sky background a little bit. I'm still leaving a bit of headroom here, and this is looking really good. We can also apply a little bit of further colour processing, a bit more sort of critically at this stage now. So just off screen, I'll click on the adjustment menu, selective colour again, and that will bring up this same tool as we saw before, and you can run through the same procedure again. Oops, yeah, it's looking quite good. By dragging this slider to the left, you can see it's enhancing sort of the red tones within the nebula. And again, this is very subjective. Because Hubble palette images are technically false colour images, it's up to the person doing the processing how far or how little they want to apply these tools. Yeah, you can see it's having a really nice effect on here. I won't change it too much. It's quite close to how I normally like the image, so we did a few adjustments earlier on, so we don't really need to do too much here. Can just enhance those blues. Yeah, it's looking quite good. I'm not going to push that too far, but you can if you want to. Okay, the image is looking quite good at this stage, but we can apply a further sharpening run on the image, and once again we ensure that we just have the base layer selected. You can turn the stars on or off, whichever suits you when you're processing. Affinity's got a really useful sharpening tool called the Clarity tool. What we'll do with the base layer selected, come up to Filters, then Sharpen, and then down to Clarity, and it brings up this slider here. You see if we take it right back down to 0 or thereabouts, just a bit fiddly, but okay, just take it. Oh, got it there. That's the image as we came in, and you can just pull this slider up, and if I push it all the way, you can see it's quite dramatic. We don't need to go that far. If we give it something like about 30, should work well. Click on Apply, and we can just monitor that by using the History tool again here. That's the before, that's the after. It's quite subtle. It's like there's a gentle contrast boost there, a gentle sort of edge sharpening, I suspect, and it always does a very good job without introducing too much noise. So that's probably as much as we need to do to this image. As I said, you can, if you want to work on the star layer separately, you can just hide it. If you found these stars had some bright halos, you could just reduce the saturation of the stars. In fact, we can do that here. Just click on that. I'll call up the vibrance tool. It's like a two-stage tool. You've got vibrance, which sort of intelligently boosts or reduces the color value of an image, or saturation, which does pretty much the same thing, but it's a bit of a stronger effect. But for example, if I just take this down to about there, that's probably a little bit too high actually, something like about there. We've just reduced the saturation of these stars. So I'll click on Merge. It's done that. And if we bring our base layer back in, you'll probably see that these stars, just going to click back until we've got, yeah, if you look at, for example, at these stars here, you can see they're just a little bit desaturated, and these ones as well. So I think that's worked quite well. If you don't like those sort of highly saturated stars, as I did there, you just select the star layer and adjust either the vibrance or the saturation, just a small amount, and it should help take the worst of the colour from the halos of those brighter stars. So that's the image. I think if you're happy with it at this stage, what I recommend you do, as before, you can do File, Save As, and if you use the AF Photo extension, let's just call it Finished, it'll save the layer structure as well. You can come back and work on this at a later stage. If you decide after having a break from working on the image, come back and look at it again, you might think, oh, I might have reduced the saturation a little bit too much, or not enough, or want to sharpen it a bit more. You can see that it's a really nice and flexible way to work, to have these three images. Technically, you wouldn't even have to save it with the reality check. That was always our sort of before and after check, and as you can see here, the difference between the original and the final processed image. And I find that since I've downloaded the Star Xterminator plugin, I have tended to change my sort of processing routines to this sort of direction now. I've found that by having the stars and the main nebula isolated from each other but still able to communicate, it really allows you to experiment with some very fine tuning on the image in a way that works incredibly well. So I hope this has given you an idea of what the plugin can do. I certainly recommend, if you're working with high quality data like we have from Telescope Live, you'll find that it's a really nice way to work. That's it. See you in the next one.